You're listening to Winnipeg's Classic 107. My name is Simon Rusnak. It's the first Friday of the month and a rather uncertain time of the year, at least weather-wise. October can be warm, almost summerish, or sometimes downright wintry. Warmer days, chillier ones, either way, a book is a great way to spend time outdoors or in. With his picks for what to read, we welcome back Chris Hall of McNally Robinson Booksellers. Hello, Chris. Great to see you.
Good morning, Simon. Great to be here.
Now, this is the first time in a very long time that we are having this chat with me in the studio, though you have joined us from abroad, haven't you?
That's true. I'm in our Saskatoon store right now. So this Zoom method really lends some flexibility to my schedule.
Yeah, that it certainly does. And I have to ask, it's the Winnipegger in me. What's the weather like out there these days?
It was fantastic on the day we drove up, and then we brought Winnipeg weather with us, so it's a bit cooler the last couple of days. So, yeah, we're receiving a few frowns, shall we say?
Exactly. We're seeing those changing seasons here in town too. Some cooler temperatures of late, though. It looks like there's some warmer temperatures looking into the next week, likely in time for your return to town. So that's certainly something to look forward to, I think. And a return to busy schedules, like you told us last month, events and book launches and festivals. Yeah. Thin Air is on it at McNally again in full swing. Prairie Ink, the list goes on and on. Though you've still found the time to pick out some new reads for us. So where should we begin this month, Chris?
Well, we're going to start with some nonfiction, some current events. Maybe it's called The Persuaders: At the Front Lines of the Fight for Hearts, Minds, and Democracy. And it's by a fellow named Anand Giridharadas. I'm pronouncing that correctly. He wrote a book a few years ago that got my attention called Winners Take All, about how our society is set up, essentially. And so now he's turned his attention to our current state of polarization, how political conversations, they often end before they can even get started because there's so little common ground between sides these days. And so this is a book about the activists, politicians, educators, everyday citizens who continue to work to try to persuade other groups of people who may disagree on some subjects, but can be reached on other important issues. And the author here, the persuasion is such a vital concept in democracy. That's something we seem to have taken for granted. And the whole point all along has been to convince enough people over to your side to gain political power. And right now it's clearly dysfunctional. And yet if we fall into the trap of giving up, our democracy may leave as well. So it's important stuff. And he's a very good writer. It's a well-told tale.
And it's certainly something that he has experienced plenty of. I was reading more on his bio, a former foreign correspondent and columnist for the New York Times, writing for other publications as well, an on-air personality, a political analyst. It sounds like he almost gives a sort of insider's perspective on things.
He does, yeah. He's very much a journalist. This is very much like character studies, almost, is how I'd almost describe them. These people, and the highs and lows of what they're trying to do. It's inspiring in a way.
Well, another take on narrative and on storytelling for your next pick from an award-winning Indigenous author, the latest from the late, great Harold R. Johnson.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is called The Power of Story: On Truth, the Trickster, and New Fictions for a New Era. And yes, Johnson's a writer very familiar to us in our parts. He's from Saskatchewan, in fact. So novelist as well as nonfiction. And as you say, unfortunately passed away earlier this year. And this book is a result of a group of people who went to visit Johnson at his home on the riverside in northern Saskatchewan. And he gave a talk about storytelling and his thoughts on the power of story. And his view of story is very similar to the way my own has developed. He argues that we tell ourselves stories to explain every aspect of life, from our personal identity to history to social arrangements, and that structure our societies. He argues that we can buy into these stories, fully, to varying degrees, but we also can recreate them to change our lives and the world. So it's a very empowering read. It puts us back into the position of storyteller, in charge of the versions of events we value, what use we want to make of things. But also, we don't need to buy the versions of stories that are currently taken for granted, say, if they don't make sense in some way, maybe we should ask them some more questions and retell the story. So it's yeah, I have often on this program talked about story in this kind of way. So I found it a very interesting read.
Yeah, it certainly sounds fascinating, and not only embracing those stories, but challenging them, even those stories that we tell ourselves.
Hmm.
And one thing that I do want to point out, there's a special event honoring
Hmm.
Harold R. Johnson and his life later this month, next week, in fact, October 12th, at the McNally store in Saskatoon. But that an event that is also going to be streamed online. Should there be anyone in the Winnipeg audience that wants to participate?
Yeah, that's great. It's the one of the bright sides of coming out of COVID is these hybrid events we're able to do. So yeah, it's taking place in Saskatchewan. But if you're interested in hearing people talk about Harold Johnson, you can tune in from wherever you are.
Next, you've got a sort of unique look at what is foundational to all of us. Cells, those little tiny units that make up our bodies, right, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. It's called The Song of the Cell, an exploration of medicine and the new human by Siddhartha Mukherjee. Now, he's a bit of a rock star for science writing. He wrote a book called The Emperor of All Maladies about cancer and how our a knowledge, I guess, of cancer, the history of our knowledge of cancer. And then he followed that up with a big book called The Gene. So he's a multi bestseller kind of author of books about science. So the cell, as you say, is the basis for all human life. And this book traces its story from our discovery of them in the 1600s. And then our through the years as we increased our knowledge of them. And at some point, once we started to reimagine ourselves as assemblages of tiny, self-contained, self-regulating units, then everything from a hip fracture to dementia to lung cancer to COVID pneumonia could be reconceived as the result of cells that started functioning abnormally. It's definitely a science book. It's got all the potential of information overload that can come with a science book, but Mukherjee, his strength is he's got such a flair for narrative and for storytelling. He just really carries you along, and it's not only that. It reminds me of being in the presence of a really passionate teacher, somebody who cares
Mm.
so much about what they're teaching you that you can't help but rise to their kind of interest and it makes it far more interesting than it could otherwise be. So you might be daunted by such a book. It's a big book and it's got a lot of information in it, but I just yeah, it's got a flow to it, and yeah, you can may not become an expert in cell biology, but you might learn a few things. I can guarantee that.
Chris, I'm sure I would learn many things because there's not a lot that I know about cell biology. But like you say, I mean, this could be one of those that is rather daunting. I was reading a little bit more on the little blurb that accompanies the text and talking about how Mukherjee and his writing just so vivid, lucid, suspenseful
Mhm.
that complex science becomes thrilling. What more do you need to hear?
It's true. Yeah, it seems odd to use a word like thrilling for it, but it's true. That's it's not out of place.
Science certainly can be thrilling. He
Yeah.
a Pulitzer Prize winner, and from a Pulitzer
Mhm.
Prize winner to a Nobel Prize winner, Knights of
Yes.
Plague.
Yeah, yes, very excited about this one myself. Knights of Plague by Orhan Pamuk. And Orhan Pamuk, I think, is one of my favorite authors. He won the Nobel Prize, as you suggest, in 2006. He's the author of lots of novels before and since then. He's from Turkey, and he tells stories that engage borderlines between different worlds. Turkey is right there in the east and west meet in Turkey, more or less. Christian and Muslim meet there. Secular and religious worlds, have real tensions there. And he takes it further into fiction and nonfiction and the borderlines there. And he never gives in to easy generalizations or solutions. He manages to keep things complicated and complex as I think life seems to be. So this new novel takes place on an imaginary island of Mengaria, which is located in the eastern Mediterranean between Crete and Cyprus. The island is half populated by Muslims, half by Orthodox Greeks, and the tension's already high when in 1900 a plague arrives. And it's interesting to me. It's a bit of a parable for our times. Something about getting the perspective and distance of time and creating it into fiction. It really allows you to see things more clearly. Like we're in the middle of the tensions that are caused by COVID's arrival, and it's hard to you take sides and the polarization I was talking about earlier. Whereas this one, you kind of can set that aside. It doesn't really matter. It's a long way away, and it's not even in a real place. So it allows you to kind of be dispassionate a bit, and see what actually happens when people can't figure out how they can't bring themselves to help each other, essentially.
Sounds like, you can be a little bit more objective, but at the same time, it sounds like it could be rather contemporary, almost like a lived experience. And certainly in today's day and age, we could relate to this novel in a way that we likely couldn't even just a few years ago, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So one last pick, a case study.
Yeah, I'm going to stick with fiction. A case study by Graham McCrae Burnett, who wrote a book called His Bloody Project a few years ago that got onto the Booker shortlist, which is always a shortlist I pay attention to. And this new novel was longlisted for this year's Booker. It didn't make it to the shortlist, but still a great book. It's and it reminds me of Harold Johnson's versions of stories. It's a story of a young woman who finds a case study she reads in a famous psychiatrist textbook. It's awfully close to her sister's story, and so she becomes very suspicious, mostly because that sister committed suicide. And our narrator starts to assume that the psychiatrist, or starts to wonder what he had to do with it. So she assumes an alter ego. The narrator is nameless, but this alter ego is named Rebecca Smith, and so she shows up at the in the offices of this famous psychiatrist to try to suss things out. And it's a novel that's very playful. It's hard to keep track of the characters a little bit, but it's framed around a set of found journals that an author, a character really named Graham McCrae Burnett, comes into possession of, and writes a novel. So it's playing with fiction and nonfiction, overlapping perspectives. This unnamed narrator tells stories about her life as Rebecca Smith, and they start to kind of coalesce together. And so the novel, in the meantime, is playing with ideas, truth, and sanity and identity all the time. You're trying to figure out what's going on and who's telling the truth and what's really happening. It's I just love these kinds of novels. It's like the unreliable narrator, or variations on what is really going on here.
Yeah, it's sort of that. Sounds like a dazzling sort of read where you're just kind of in awe of what's going on and trying to keep track, and you're just along for the ride, which is a real joy.
Except every once in a while, a question kind of comes up. I wonder if I do this.
Well, Chris, as always, you're finding reads that challenge us and make us question ourselves while still enjoying what's going on in these novels and in these wonderful books. As always, you can find Chris's picks up at classic107.com. Chris, great seeing you.
Nice to see you. Thanks again, Simon.